And for people that are out there that, again, thinking about niche practice, industry areas or whatever, these other opportunities arise. And I imagine you didn't just say, hey, I'm going to go do this one day. It was probably each one of these things was created in response to issues or problems being raised by your clients and others in the industry. Like, hey, that's a problem. We can go solve that.
Right. And being entrepreneurial in a firm setting, your own founding partner sort of world gives you the flexibility. And I have to sort of go back as the big step into the void when David and I started Weissman & Zucker in 99 after, being at my firm for 12 years as just an employee partner of my firm. You make this entrepreneurial step and you realize that it's a big jump to get there, but I want to motivate people that the opportunity of taking those steps, of starting your own practice, partnering with others to start a small firm and being independent and entrepreneurial has these advantages where you can be more flexible, where you have the opportunity to create other businesses. Oh, look, there's plenty of lawyers that are in the real estate business that do side investments with their clients for real estate development. It's the same sort of thing. I've just picked to do cooperation with my clients in a niche area of self-storage because I see the needs, just like you're saying, that have come up over the years as compared to a real estate deal here or a real estate deal there.
Welcome to the Founding Partner Podcast. Join your host, Jonathan Hawkins, as we explore the fascinating stories of successful law firm founders. We'll uncover their beginnings, triumph over challenges, and practice growth. Whether you aspire to launch your own firm, have an entrepreneurial spirit, or are just curious about the legal business, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
Welcome to Founding Partner Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Hawkins. This is a podcast where I get to interview law firm founders and hear about their journeys and some of the cool things they're up to. And today's guest I met fairly recently, and he has done and is doing some really cool stuff. So I'm excited to have Scott Zucker on the podcast today. Scott is an attorney here in Atlanta. He's got his own firm. He has developed an interesting niche practice. I'll just call it self-storage law. I'll let him really flesh that out a little bit. But Scott, welcome to the show. Why don't you give a quick sort of overview of your firm and what kind of work what you do nowadays?
Well, hey, Jonathan, thank you so much for having me on the program. I'm excited to do this with you today. I guess I fall into your founding partner definition because in 1999, a buddy of mine, David Weissman, and I started Weissman & Zucker here in Buckhead. And here we are, our 26th or 27th year later. And yeah, it's been quite a ride. So I always love talking about the adventures we've gone on to have our firm and have it still be here all these years later. So I started my practice in 1987. I know I only look, 30, but I've been at this a while. And after 12 years at my initial firm, I started as an associate and became a partner there. This opportunity of running off and being entrepreneurial with David came up. And so after 12 years at my earlier firm, we started this firm. And getting to the question of the self-storage practice, I always remember one of my earliest partners at my old firm would say, Scott, there's a big difference between having cases and clients, right? You can have cases, but that's not how you build a business. You have to build clients. So I went out to build a client base because that's what I had understood was my job as a young associate at this firm. And one of my first cases that became a client was a developer building a self-storage facility. I think this goes back to 1990 almost. And I worked with him on the development and construction matters relating to that practice. That was the area that I was primarily working in back then. And it was self-storage, so he built it. And then he came back later and said, Scott, how do I operate it? Are there any rules relating to operating self-storage? And I was like, I have no idea, but I'll look it up for you. And I looked it up and realized there was laws that related to the regulatory operation of a self-storage facility, which always sort of amazes people that our legislature bothered to look up and create laws for self-storage, but there were laws. So I guided him through his property. I love to write, and we'll talk about that later. So I wrote an article. It got published in the National Trade Magazine for Self-Storage. And then there was somebody who read the article and had a conference on self-storage, invited me to speak on it. And lo and behold, now, 35 years later or more, I've been doing, quote, self-storage law since then. I have to caveat, my wife always jokes, in sort of a funny, not funny way, but, what are we going to put on my tombstone? And it's going to say, here lies a self-storage lawyer. But anyway.
So, well, we can put your ashes. We know where to store your ashes. We could put it in.
Don't laugh. That's happened many, many a times. We have found ashes in self-storage facilities. I always wonder about families that care so much about their loved ones that they store their ashes in a self-storage facility.
So I love that story. I love lawyers that sort of make their way into a niche practice, and I love hearing how they did it. So I'm curious though. That's a great story. You had the one client, wrote an article, and it led to all these things. I imagine, and maybe this is not the case, but did you have some other types of clients and other types of matters that you sort of did the same thing, and then it just sort of gravitated towards the self-storage, or was that the only thing that really happened?
Well, the first firm I was at, again, I was there for 12 years, and I did the work that I was supposed to do with the partners that I learned from, all that were great mentors for me. And I was a construction development type lawyer in the early days, and I was doing that work, but that was, doing chemical plants or manufacturing centers. There wasn't anything niche-y about it, and they already had their lawyers and everything. But when it came to the world of self-storage, it was a new industry back in 1990. I mean, the first self-storage facilities were only built, arguably the first generation were built in the late 70s and 80s. So it was a new industry. And the fact that I was sort of a young lawyer with young clients, and I seemed to be paying attention to them, made a natural fit. So yeah, there were other areas of construction and development that I were doing, other industry verticals that I could have gotten involved in. And I certainly made an effort to write about some of those things. But my, quote, success came from the fact that I was the only guy, and very much still in this industry, so there are only a handful of lawyers that do what I do, cared enough about the self-storage industry to really focus on it. And I took a shot, and I'm very lucky because the self-storage industry grew from a relatively fledgling real estate sector to one of the most successful real estate sectors right now. I joke, and I've said this to a lot of people, and I think they realize it after they hear this podcast. If you drive home tonight and you're looking on each side of the street, wherever you're driving, you're going to see a self-storage facility. And there are more self-storage facilities than there are fast food restaurants combined. Like all the McDonald's, all the Wendy's, all the Taco Bells, put them all together, and there's still less than the number of self-storage facilities there are in this country. It's that sort of unique industry.
That is amazing. That is an amazing statistic. Wow. It's interesting. So during COVID and sort of maybe the year or two after COVID, I may have mentioned this before, but I was on Twitter because we had nothing else to do, and there was a whole sort of Twitter community about self-storage. It just exploded. Everybody's like, I'm buying it, this, that, and the other, sort of from, I guess, 2020 to 2023. I don't know if you were on Twitter or if you sort of noticed an explosion in your business.
Yeah, well, it was a phenomenon because of COVID. There was an uptick in the industry, and I think essentially people realized that they were going to stay at home, had to get all the junk out of their home to make room for their offices and their families and everything, and use self-storage. The occupancy levels for self-storage during those periods skyrocketed. There was a concern about oversupply. I could even guarantee you in 2019, early 2020, there were discussions about overbuilding in this industry, and that all changed in 2 months with COVID. I can't. I don't want to say it was the best thing that ever happened to self-storage, but in a way, it certainly opened the market to having people realize that they can put their stuff somewhere else that doesn't have to be their home or garage or basements.
So you write this article, You get invited to speak at this conference. How big was the conference? Was this brand? I mean, it's sort of a young industry. Was it pretty big? I mean,
the first one I went to was in Chicago, Illinois. I felt like such a big shot. I can't tell you that I went into my partners. I've been asked to speak at this conference in Chicago. And there were probably 400 to 500 attendees at that conference. If you look at those conferences now in our industry, there's upwards of 4,000 people at these conferences with vendors and operators. So it was a relatively small conference. And again, there weren't lawyers that were really talking about the laws. And now, in realizing that every state has their own independent self-storage law, there is no model law. There's an attempt at a model law, but each state's law is different. So the confusion, especially with multi-state operators, is how am I operating in different states? So they really needed counseling as to following the laws. And then it sort of blossomed into not just regulatory compliance, but everybody has an employee, so how to manage their employees, and everybody needs to understand their marketing rules about proper marketing of their properties. So it became a bit with understanding those issues. Now we deal with data breach issues and cyber liability. I mean, it's just an interesting breadth of legal issues that come up within the operation of this industry vertical.
That's a great point. There are lots of different, I'll call niche practice areas. I mean, you can go to family law, you can go personal injury. Your niche is sort of an industry niche. And then when you get into that, there's so many verticals or whatever underneath it or underneath the umbrella that you can really grow the practice in lots of interesting and different ways. And then the other point, which I wanted to follow up on too, is the national level of it. Each state is sort of its own animal. And then, sort of how have you developed, I guess you have a national sort of practice as well, or tell me about that.
Well, I do. I mean, I speak on, globally on the issues that impact the industry from a legal perspective. We're dealing with both with state legislative issues as well as federal legislative issues that affect the industry. And one thing I would tell you is a lesson learned from all this, and certainly for your listeners, sort of the advice is build out your network of trusted lawyers in other states. Because if you find a client that is a strong growing client, it's likely they're going to cross over into other states, and you need the resources of those of lawyers in those states. So I've built up a network over the last 35 years of great lawyers throughout the country that I can turn to and refer matters and work with them on matters that have happened around the country. So that's an important thing. You have to be able to trust. You have to be willing to work with them for the same client, not be worried they're going to steal clients, things like that. It's a real team effort to build an national industry practice.
That's the other thing. So I don't know if you know Joe Freed, another lawyer here in Atlanta. He's the trucking lawyer. And, he said years ago when he started that, people told him he was crazy. They're like, there aren't enough cases, blah, blah, blah. And his point was, well, when you niche down, then you can grow geographically. And it sounds like that's pretty much what you've done. Because again, probably back then, you're like, the fledgling industry, there aren't that many in Atlanta. I mean, probably like, am I crazy to even try?
There's certainly the crazy, if I even try, comments that have come along the years. But I do believe, and again, this is why I like to talk about this for young lawyers especially, I think a niche practice is really important because there's so many lawyers out there, and they're all great lawyers, and they all do a lot of the same things in terms of a general litigation, real estate practice. But when you dig into an area and really know what you're talking about with regard to the laws, the history of precedents, the best practices of an industry, and really know it and really can counsel your clients in that niche, people will seek you out and you will get work because you're knowledgeable in an area. I don't pretend to be the most knowledgeable lawyer about everything. This is why I have the network of lawyers that I work with in these specific areas. But I know this industry, so if an issue comes up, I know who to call, I know where to get the information and the answer that people need. And that's been a resource for my clients as well. So I think a niche practice, whether you're in a small firm or a big firm, can be really valuable.
And so for maybe a younger lawyer out there that may be thinking about how do I develop a practice, do you have any advice on looking back, the things that worked, didn't work, on how you grew this thing, maybe some things they should think about as they start to explore developing a niche practice?
Well, I've read some of your articles on this question of, do you say yes or do you say no? And I've always said yes. Maybe too much. I speak at every conference that I get invited to. I write every article that I'm asked to write. I believe in the concept of communication to develop a practice. So I'm very much, for a young lawyer, I believe in saying yes. I have this expression that I warned you about. It goes with a great story, but it's the go out, get seen out, get asked out philosophy. And it came from my wife's best friend when they were in college. Her mother would say to her daughter, go out, get seen out, and you'll get asked out. And I thought that was the most hysterical advice for the dating scene, but it's true for lawyers that are marketing too. Is you can't sit in your office and build a practice. You have to go out. People do lunches and things like that. I believe in the concept of education. I believe if I go out, write articles, speak at conferences, that people will better themselves by learning. And then if they need me, they know where to go. And that's been my philosophy. So I say yes, and I'm speaking at conferences and writing articles. I've written so many articles that, as you know, they've become books of compilations of articles, to the fact that there's a book coming out this spring of my articles that's over 200 pages long, because it's just, maybe I should stop, but I'm still writing articles.
Well, that was going to be my next question or point, is obviously write articles and you speak, you go everywhere, but you have written a lot of books. Now, you've written some fiction too. We'll talk about that as well, but you are a writer. You're just a writer, and you are a really good marketer, and that's what really hit me immediately. So tell me about, how many books have you written at this point?
Well, in the industry legal education side, these compilations of articles, and actually that's a good point, because don't ever sit down and go, I got to write a book. Because it's mind blowing. It's too hard. The white page that you'd have to start typing on is insurmountable sometimes. I've thought of it in little pieces. So I've written articles, and then these articles have become compilation of industry education books. So I've written 2 books that are called Legal Topics and Self-Storage, that are published by the National Association and sold to members and operators that are out there. I've written rental agreement handbooks. I've worked with another lawyer, and we've done state lien manuals, 50 state lien manuals. We've written books on lien sales and collection practices, a lot of industry writing. Because when you're out this as long as I have, there's a lot that we've written out there, and form books and all that sort of stuff. So that's all the legal stuff. When I wasn't doing all the legal writing, and I, again, love to write, and I know there's folks out there that feel the same way. They want to express themselves. I always thought I was going to write the great American novel. That's a lot of us lawyers, we go to law school and we're thinking this is a part-time gig until I'm, a well-established novelist. But, inspired by the John Grishams and the Scott Zuckers out there, I started and wrote my first legal thriller. And then I wrote a family redemption novel, all fiction. And then lastly, I just wrote a historical fiction novel about World War II. So I just wanted to write. I wanted to come to the office. Sometimes I'd come early in the morning, and instead of writing a self-storage article, I'd want to write a chapter in a book. And those chapters became books. And each book, last thing I'll say, each book took about 5 or 6 years to write. So it takes time, but I don't want people to think you got to sit down and write a book. You just sit down and write a chapter, and eventually those chapters become a book.
Yeah, I was going to ask what your process was, but it sounds just a little bit consistently, just working on it a little bit at a time, and then all of a sudden you've got a book.
You got a book. You did it yourself. It's the same thing. I'm looking at your law firm book behind you. I think that the creation of something tangible of your writings is, you want to help people and you want to share that information. I did that with a mediation book that I've also written with my mediation articles. I think it's something to create something concrete and tangible is a very meaningful act of humanity in a way. So very proud that I've been able to do this.
So let's talk about your mediation practice for a moment. Again, when I got to know you and saw all the things you did to build your self-storage legal practice, you'd mentioned that you were starting or had been starting to develop your mediation practice. And I had seen some of your articles before we met. I was like, okay, yeah. And so you're sort of using a similar playbook to do that, and you had a book there. So clearly it's worked for you, and so you're sort of using the same playbook for the mediation practice. So how is that going, and has it been working?
It actually is the same playbook. That actually, you're probably the first person to recognize that it's the same thing of go out, get seen out, get asked out for my mediation practice, the same way I was doing for my self-storage practice. The mediation practice grew from the fact that eventually I focused on the litigation side of self-storage. It became very much a dispute-oriented business with landlords and tenants and vendors and contractors. So it was constantly litigation focused. So I've spent a lot of my years as a litigator, both on the plaintiffs and defendants side. And I really struggled with the fact that litigation is an expensive, time-consuming, inefficient process in the real sense of things. But that's what we had. But in the late 80s, early 90s, you started seeing ADR, and I was exposed to participating in arbitrations and mediations in my practice, and it really worked, and I really thought it was successful. So in 2015, about 10 or 11 years ago, I started my mediation service as a service of my law firm. Obviously not my clients, but wanted to market it as an alternative to people that were coming to our law firm, not to hire me as a litigator, but hire me for the purpose of being an arbitrator or mediator. I had a fun, creative, epic resolution services. I created this company, and we were rocking along pretty much doing mediations and arbitrations as an independent neutral for 10 years. Same sort of thing, like you said, the same playbook. I wrote about mediation. I spoke about mediations. I've done a lot with the state bar and the Atlanta bar. Very proud to have been the chair of both the Atlanta bar ADR section and the chair of the state bar ADR section, and built up a reputation in that niche, moving away from litigation to do more mediation. So it is the same playbook. And recently I joined Miles Mediation and moved the Epic platform into the Miles platform. And it's been a lot of fun. And I think ultimately I believe in the concept of dispute resolution through mediation and arbitration because of its success and the benefit to the participants, cost effectiveness, efficiency, and participation in resolution.
So let me give you my observations about mediators, and then I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
Just from practicing law, 20 plus years at this point, you see a litigation lawyer, a trial lawyer, they work their entire life, their whole entire career, and then they turn 65 or 68, and then they retire from the practice, and then they become a mediator. And then they're a judge, and they retire, and they become a mediator. And they just sit there and feel like, oh, the cases will just come. And I've seen, you've probably seen it too, lots of these attorneys that sort of pop out for a year and then they disappear, pop out for a year and disappear, because they don't do the things you're doing. They don't go market the practice. And then if they don't do that, then they're not going to develop the mediation practice. I see that over and over again. I'm sure you have too. And then the other piece is the ones that maybe do market a little, they wait till the very end, where really maybe you should start a little bit earlier, because it takes a while to develop any kind of practice area, including mediation. So are my observations semi-correct there? What do you think?
I think so. I mean, that's why I started 10 years ago. I knew this would take a lot of lead time. I'm not there yet. I mean, I'm still growing the practice, and I'm still, practicing through my firm as well, because I think it's very difficult for someone to retire one day as a practicing lawyer and then start the next day as a mediator and think you're going to get the work. And I agree with you. It takes time. You are developing a practice. So for the folks out there that are interested in it, you got to start now. You got to get the proper training, get the proper observation of mediations, try to participate both as an advocate and as an observer as much as possible. Going back to basically say yes every chance you get. And then you can build a practice. I haven't, it's interesting. when it comes to the concept of niche mediation practices, I've been close to that in the area of construction, because I spent a lot of my years as a construction lawyer in that world of self-storage. But I've been hesitant to just be a construction mediator. I'm at this point still a general legal practice mediator, but with time may tell. I mean, I may end up needing my own advice and focusing only on one area of law to perfect my strength as a mediator and arbitrator. So it's kind of an interesting, evolving process for me. We'll check back in 10 years and see how it's going.
So what about practice. Geographic reach of your mediation practice? Are you'll go anywhere, or are you staying in the Georgia, Atlanta area? What's
It's interesting. Since you don't need a license, a bar license to be a mediator. I mean, effectively, I could mediate around the country, and I know there are mediators and arbitrators that do that. My focus is probably close to home. I have, and still do, travel a lot for meetings and matters around the country. So, if I could stay closer to home, I'm fine with that as the years go on. I've got a grandchild now, so closer I can be, the better.
There you go. Yeah, I get it. So I want to shift. So another thing that is really intriguing, interesting about you is this concept of an ethical will. And I saw a TED Talk that you gave. So maybe why don't you explain what you mean by an ethical will, and then we'll dive into that.
So here it goes back to my writing. And not everybody's like this. And I want to take people on this sort of journey, and you don't have to do it the same way that I did it, but I do like to write. So with that in the backdrop, I lost my parents when I was in my mid to late 20s. And as I got married and started having children, there was a void in me not having all of the stories, lessons learned, advice sort of thing that many of us get from our parents, into their 40s, 50s, and 60s, some of us, about life, raising children, managing illness, managing stress, all the things that are out there. So when I had a young family, I really thought it was my duty, in case something ever happened to me and they didn't have their dad around, to make sure that I shared with them my philosophy, my feelings, my stories, my lessons, my advice on topics. So just the same way I talked about writing chapters of the book, I picked topics and I wrote about them, and I gathered them together, and I created this book of, at that point, it was 40 things about turning 40. And when I turned 50, it was 50 things about turning 50 and 60 things about turning 60. And I created this book of writings about my family and my feelings about particular areas, as important as the areas of how I feel about marriage, how I feel about religion, and as silly as how I feel about dogs, and how I feel about baseball, and how I feel about golf. I mean, it's just, I wanted them to make sure that anything ever happened to me, they maybe could know me through my writing. Okay, so I wrote this thing, and then I shared it with my rabbi. And I said, I wrote all this because I wanted to make sure that it was there in case anything happened to me. And he said to me, "You've written an ethical will." I said, "What's an ethical will?" And so then I went out and learned that the creation of something, people do it by legacy letters. Some people do it creatively through art. Some people do it creatively, poetry writing, but they create something that shares their lessons, their advice, their experiences in a tangible fashion that can be shared with their loved ones, either during their life or after they're gone. And the creation of that legacy document, it to me, and I'm absent that from my parents, but to me is, I've understood now, after I talk about this with people, one of the most valuable items, tangible items they'll ever have in their lives. People that get letters from their parents on their wedding dates, or letters, about their experiences. All that being said, so I learned about the topic of ethical wills and really started digging into understanding how important it was for people to do this type of legacy writing. I started speaking at it at synagogues and churches and hospitals and hospices, and people really reacted to it. They loved the sharing and the reminder that we're not going to be here forever, that we need to create something for our families and our loved ones as a reminder of who we were and what we believed in and what we loved and what we fought for and what we tried to accomplish in our lives. And it led me ultimately to a recommendation to speak about it via a TEDx talk here in Atlanta. So I did that. It's just a passion project. I am not a trust and estates lawyer, as we've discussed. I'm just a commercial litigator, but it's a topic that I think everyone needs to talk about and think about, and anybody with a family should be responsible for creating.
Well, I think it's an incredible concept, and it's now on my very high up on my list of things I need to start doing. I think it's great. And that TED Talk was incredible. And I mean, there were times you give some examples from people, and, you know, I was tearing up. It's pretty powerful stuff. And anybody out there, I would recommend go find the TED Talk, watch that, and think about the concepts that you're talking about and putting these things together. Real quick, if you haven't gotten a copy yet, please check out my book, The Law Firm Life Cycle. It's written for law firm owners and those who plan to be owners. In the book, I discuss various issues that come up as a law firm progresses through the stages of its growth, from just before starting a firm to when it comes to an end. The Law Firm Life Cycle is available on Amazon. Now back to the show. So let me ask about yours specifically. You said it's a book. Did you bind it? Is it just printed out? What did you do for the actual product?
I wrote it originally as these separate topics, again, issues from integrity and honesty to family to having children to raising teenagers. You know, I wrote a chapter about my older son getting married. I mean, just how I feel about all these things. Not that anybody really cares, but I thought it was important for me to share it. And I did originally just keep it as a printed out log of topics. But as I got more into it, I did start crafting it as a potential book that others would read. Not as much about, it's hard to describe, like as an example, a guidebook of how to do it. And it's yet to be published, but it would be in the sense of an example of a way to write an ethical will. So it provides instructions, and my book ends up being an example, but then it would be something that somebody could read. It hasn't been finished yet, but it is something I've thought about. In fact, one of the most fun things that I did with the book when I was working on trying to think about publishing it is at the beginning of each chapter, I found a quote that discussed the topic. And, whether it be something from Abraham Lincoln or George Carlin, it would be a quote about the topic. So it went from, either serious or fun. Anyway, so that is a project that I've worked on. We'll see what happens.
Well, I could see, as I'm thinking about it, is you could create a hardcover book. You could I'm talking about me, put in photos, family photos that sort of reflect what you're talking about or about the time that you write it. And even if you never put it out into the world, it's just something that's sort of like a family heirloom. All the kids get it, and then you could get the grandkids could get it. It's just sort of this thing that in the family somebody has it, and maybe even have, I guess it's a thumb drive nowadays or DVD or whatever with actual video or audio recording, so you can hear what you sound like. I mean, you could really do really cool things with this.
I love it. In fact, you'll see that there are commercial products out there that offer that. It's simplified now to create these memory books. I wish I had come up with the creative commercial side for doing it, but you're right. I mean, everything you're talking about that has a tangible sense of a family heirloom is extremely relevant to this topic. I'll tell you a story. It was in the living section of the old Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'll never forget reading this story about a house fire, and the only thing he got his kids out and his family and all that, but the only thing he wanted tangibly out of his house was a letter that his father had written to him that was in a keepsake box in his closet. And I mean, he fought through a fire to get that box that had this letter in it because it was that important as a family heirloom. And he talks about that legacy letter being the key to, what he wanted. He didn't care about the rest of the house. He got his family out. He just wanted that letter because he couldn't imagine losing that letter in the fire.
Wow. Well, again, listeners, I encourage you to find the TED Talk. It's really, really powerful stuff. All right. So I want to shift back a little bit, back to the law firm. And so another thing that we hadn't talked about yet that I think's cool about some of the things you did. So you found this niche practice, this niche industry practice, and you crafted or created your law practice around it. But that's not all you did. You have created some, I'll call them ancillary businesses, these other, I guess, educational, non-legal, whatever you want to call them, ancillary businesses that are also around the niche industry. So tell me about that and how those came about and you know.
Yeah, so you recognize when you're in an industry as deep as I've gotten into the self-storage industry that there's elements that are not addressed for the benefit of the business owner, whether it be a hotline for quick information about the statutes that are out there, or quick information about best practices in a particular area. There needs to be a resource for people in a particular industry. So a lot of these national associations create these hotline systems for their members to have a resource to get information. So we've been lucky enough to work with the National Self-Storage Association to create a hotline service for its members. And one of the services within that is the legal information piece of it, because it is an industry that is highly regulated and has these state and federal laws that apply to operation. So a regular layman operator that's working in its business that's not familiar with wage and hour laws that might affect their employees, or lunch hour rules that affect, or PTO rules. I mean, it could be something like that they're looking for information. Rather than go to Google for it, they go through their National Association membership hotline for information. So we've been able to staff that as a resource for the National Association. Same way that we've supported building out a form book for operators in the industry, whereas otherwise there weren't these documents that they need for notice to tenants to comply with the notice requirements under the law, the leases, the advertisements that they use as part of a lien foreclosure process. This sort of form book guidance has been an ancillary business as well that we've cooperated, especially with the National Association, to provide. One of the most unique businesses that have grown out of here is the ADA laws that apply to self-storage and the retrofit kits that are needed for self-storage operators to make their units accessible to the disabled under the applicable ADA laws. We assisted in creating the compliant retrofit kits that fall within the law. Law sort of takes over everything. I mean, we're in it as lawyers, but sometimes we don't realize how hard it is for business operators to understand and to address all these things. So, once you're in an industry, you end up being a resource for all these little segments, and they've all become little ancillary services, sometimes investments for us, sometimes business units. And being an entrepreneurial practice founding partner of our firm, we have the ability and the flexibility to do these other ancillary businesses different than you would if you were in a big firm where there'd be no room for you to be doing, I don't want to call it side hustles, because they're all part of the same package of services, but essentially it's doing more than just billing by the hour for the legal services you provide.
Yeah, I think that's really, really cool stuff. And for people that are out there that, again, thinking about niche practice industry areas or whatever, these other opportunities arise. And I imagine you didn't just say, hey, I'm going to go do this one day. It was probably each one of these things was created in response to issues or problems being raised by your clients and others in the industry. Like, hey, that's a problem. We can go solve that.
Right. And then being entrepreneurial in a firm setting, that your own founding partner sort of world, gives you the flexibility. And I have to sort of go back as the big step into the void when David and I started Weissman and Zucker in '99, after being at my firm for 12 years as just an employee partner of my firm. you make this entrepreneurial step and you realize that it's a big jump to get there. But I want to motivate people that the opportunity of taking those steps, of starting your own practice, partnering with others to start a small firm and being independent and entrepreneurial has these advantages where you can be more flexible, where you have the opportunity to create other businesses. Oh, look, there's plenty of lawyers that are in the real estate business that do side investments with their clients for real estate development. It's the same sort of thing. I've just picked to do cooperation with my clients in a niche area of self-storage because I see the needs, just like you're saying, that have come up over the years as compared to a real estate deal here or a real estate deal there.
It's interesting you said that. When I started my firm, it's been about almost 8 years to the day now. We're almost there. I remember in the first 6 to 8 months, all these opportunities that before I would not have been able to pursue. They just started coming. Hey, I'll try that. I'll try this. I'll try that. It was just the world had opened up. And we had talked about this, I think, before we went, maybe earlier on this call, but it's, I was saying yes to everything. And then I finally had to say no. I was like, I don't have time for all of these things. But it was really exciting and cool to be able to, like you said, have the opportunity to sort of pursue some of these side hustles, I'll call them, but other opportunities that when I was at my firm, I could not have done that.
Yeah. It's funny that you're talking about the no factor because you say it glibly that you started saying no, but it's hard to say no. Yes. Because this also goes with the type of personality that I'm sure you and I are, and some of your listeners who think about this as going out there and starting their practices, is it feels like a challenge, and in order to succeed, sometimes you have to do things that are uncomfortable. So it is a yes. Maybe you're out there early on signing up to do, defense work for local courts. I mean, to get the business, sometimes you just have to work to get where you want to get. It's not always easy. I believe that there's lots of really strong success stories out there of people that took that chance, and it took a little while, and a lot of yeses and maybe some nos, but, and taking on clients that maybe they didn't want, but needed to. And eventually you build up that practice that is the practice that you want.
And I've heard others talk about this. I can't remember, I don't know if it was Steve Jobs, somebody. You get to a point in your life and your career and you look back and you can see the points and sort of the line that was drawn, and it sort of makes sense as you look back. But when you're in it, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And I look at mine and, I tried a lot of things over the years, and I'm like, well, I didn't really like that, so I quit doing that. And then I tried this, and I slowly sort of came to where I am now, to an area that really was interesting to me, that I could sit with for many years and just continue to just grow and learn, and it engaged me long enough. I imagine you had probably similar experience.
Yeah, I also want to separate out the focus on business and maybe the concept of making money as a lawyer practicing law, to separate it from the humanity of who we are as people. You always have to save room for yourself, your family, that balance, and that's not easy too, especially when you're operating your own business or running your own law firm. But I found, and maybe this goes back to my writing my novels, I'm a slow marathon runner over the years, a very bad golfer, but I love it. Try to find the things that balance your life so that you're not feeling like you are working all the time as well. And that's hard to do. Our culture as lawyers is to focus, a lot of us, billable hour. Well, as long as there's an hour in a day, I can work it and make money. There is a balance. It's not easy to see when you're a younger lawyer, but it's important, like you said, to look back and go, I'm glad I spent a little time doing this with my family, and I'm glad I did these travels with my family. I mean, time passes pretty quickly. You want to try to get in as much as you can. So I want to advise people, we can talk about building businesses and working hard all day long, and I'm a big believer of it because I am an A-type worker, but find the balance, find the things that you enjoy that are your hobbies, and try to, fit that into your world.
So let's dig into that a little bit. You seem very grounded and centered to me. Have you always been this way, or is this something you learned later and you're looking back and say, I should have been doing this earlier in my life?
I had a straight path from the beginning. People make fun of me all the time. I'm very, high school, college, law school, practice. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I actually thought I was going to go into law school for public service, for politics, for leadership in policy-driven areas. A lot of wrongs that needed right in the world, sort of thing. It didn't work out that way, which is fine. But I had very much a straight path. My wife and I just celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary. I have 2 children one is married with a child, one's getting married next week. So I've been very lucky in terms of having a strong family unit, friends and family around us to keep us grounded. And I will tell you this, I mean, from the point of view, you're asking about our personalities and what drives us. I'm sure this is true for you and certainly for your listeners. Many of us are goal oriented, so there's nothing wrong with that. And I talk to my kids about this all the time. I mean, being motivated to succeed, not just about the money, but the personal feeling of that you've worked hard to achieve something is a strong motivator. There's also a motivator called fear. And I think that can also be part of who we are. We are afraid of what happens if we don't stay on that path and do the things that we're supposed to do and work hard. So I like a little fear mixed into the excitement and energy of a goal. So I urge your listeners to recognize that all these balances, but fear and failure can be a motivator as well.
Great point. That motivates me for sure. I think there's a line that you don't want to cross. You don't want it to be crippling fear, but a little bit of fear is a great motivator. It really is. And if you don't feel it, if you can create it somehow, I agree with you. And then the other side of it is for those of us, with families is that you want to, your kids and others, I believe, are always looking. I mean, they're watching, they're learning, and you're trying to set role models and be an example. You got to do the right things, and sometimes that's the important side of it too. Is my expression, I wish maybe I could trademark it, is be your legacy. Like, be your legacy. So be the person you want to be to create that history of who you are and what you create. That's what's led me to the practice. That's what led me to the writing of the books. That's what led me to the ethical wills. That's pushed me actually through some 25, 26 mile runs of you got to be who you believe you should be. I love that. So I want to step back. It's clear to me you're an entrepreneur. I wonder how long you've had this. Maybe you've had it since you were a kid. But there's an interesting thing, my sense, there's no data behind this, but most writers are the freewheeling artists, starving artists. They're not business people usually. I can pick a few examples, I'm sure. But you are a writer. You've been a writer your entire life. You also have this entrepreneurial drive. Typically, you don't find people that have both of those elements. Have you ever thought about that?
I have. I mean, I would tell you that my dream of being a novelist and writing as a career, I'd be broke. I mean, I don't know how, especially in this market with novelists, people don't make money. So I realized that I could only do this as a hobby and not as my career. I always joke when I see these movies, that people say to their spouses, honey, I'm just going to write a novel and, don't worry about it. We got everything covered. It's like, it's so hard to, I mean, there are people out there that are successful at it. Look, believe me, I wish I was John Grisham every day. I just so envy the ability. And I heard about him speaking at a conference recently. He writes a book every year, starts like fresh on January 1st. And that's what he does. He gets to be creative every day to write and make a living out of it. And I wish I could do that. I realized that that I couldn't. And that was, so there's a side of me that's creative, but there's a whole side of me that's so practical. So I realized that I had to keep my day job. I would get up early, like very early. I'd come into the office and I'd sit at my desk and I'd write before people came into the office. And then I'd put on my lawyer hat and work the rest of the day. And I'd come in and I'd write a chapter, off and on for years, and finally write the novel. So there's been a practical side to it. I wish I could say I was sort of free and loose about that. If anybody wants to sign me to a contract to just write books, I probably would give up my practice at this point. But look, I'm working on a book right now. It is the sequel to my first novel, sequel to Chain of Custody, the continuing adventures of the protagonist young lawyer who fought the big fight. Boy, it's hard to write. It's still hard to write. I come in, I see that blank white page, and I write a chapter.
It reminds me of the Stephen Pressfield book, the War of Art. I think that's what it is. Or it is just a battle to get it out there. It's funny, growing up, I played the drums, and I was in high school band, a band in high school that we played, and I wanted to be a rock star. That's what I wanted to be. And I thought I was going to be one. Thankfully, the practical side kicked in, because even if, and I still love music and I love musicians, you can be the best musician in the world, if you could even say that. So talented, play anything, all these things, and you could still never make it. You'd be starving and all this. And writing's probably the same. You could be the best novelist, but it's like you need a little bit of luck. You need that lucky break or whatever, the spark to get there. And so you got to be practical. That's how, at least that was my conclusion.
But I'll tell you something about with the book, and I think that this might be true for your drumming. Go out, get seen out, get asked out. I want to see you on stage playing your drums. Maybe you'll be discovered. There's American Idol out there. People are still getting discovered. I talk to people about my books. I share my books with people. You never know. Maybe one day somebody's going to pick up the book and go, you're a good writer. Maybe, you can write another one. So you never know. I am not giving up until it's done. Like, well, Jonathan, we got to go out there, and you got to play the drums, and I got to write.
Well, writers are different. You don't want to see the old guy musicians, I'll tell this story. I went to see the drummer of Pink Floyd. I can't remember his name now, but he was on tour a few years ago, and he had all these young musicians around him, and he's like 80 behind the drum sets, right? He's old. It's the first time I saw 3 of the audience members walked in with walkers. I mean, they were walking in, it was like, it was great show, but yeah. I don't want to be that guy. But he, he filled it up because he was in Pink Floyd. Well, there's still time. Maybe I'll make it.
Yeah. There's always time. There's always time. You never know. Some of these guys, look, there's writers. That's maybe that gives me hope. Is there's writers out there that get discovered late in life. So, we'll see. Yeah. I've always been trying to get my book, and I've sent this to producers. When I write, just as a aside about the writing, I'm a very visual writer. So what helps me write is I see the scene and I visualize the conversation or the event or the incident, and then I'll write it because I visualize it. I think all of my books are really meant to be movies. I don't write them as screenplays, but I write them, visually. So I am hopeful one day we're going to see one of these books as a movie, but you never give up. You never know. There's a lot of bad movies out there too.
All right, so you got a moment to plug. What's the first novel? Or
first one is called Chain of Custody. Second one's called Rally on 2, and the last one's called Battle for Life. Now, and I will share this. So the Battle for Life story, just going back to the ethical will writing, essentially is an ethical will. It's written as a story as a father and a son. My father was in World War II, so I was the youngest of 4 children. So my father was older when I was born. And that I lost him when I was still younger, but he was at a famous Battle of Okinawa at the end of World War II on an aircraft carrier that was hit by kamikazes. It's a famous battle. It's a famous naval incident, and he was very quiet about it. I really didn't understand the full impact of his story until after he was gone. And I knew I always wanted to write about it. And I knew my point of view of an ethical will to share a story between a father and a son. So when I wrote Battle for Life, it is the mythical, inspirational story of a 90-year-old man sharing a lesson with his 60-year-old son who has a 30-year-old grandson, right? So there's family tree. Not anything I had, but how I inspired to believe how that family message would be shared, all in the backdraft of World War II and his experiences. So I like the story because it's based upon my dad's experience. It's a sharing of a message through the storytelling of his experiences. So I like that book. I can visually see it. I have lots of pictures of his ship and how he was as a dapper 19-year-old as a naval seaman in 1944. It's pretty crazy.
That's a cool concept. I'll check it out. But yeah, anybody else, go check out his books. I assume they're on Amazon.
They are.
All right, great.
Absolutely.
All right, two more questions. We'll start with, for anybody out there thinking about starting a firm, maybe early stages, any pieces of advice maybe you'd give to those folks?
Yeah, I believe I couldn't have done it alone. So if you're thinking about starting your own firm by yourself, that's a really tough enterprise. Maybe it's not another lawyer that you're working with, but at least a strong paralegal or a strong legal assistant, someone that you can back you up, is sort of how I feel about a partnership in any sort of business enterprise. It's really hard to go it alone, and it's also more fun to do it with other people. There's this sort of suffering together that happens when you do these projects with others. So I encourage people to be entrepreneurial. I believe in it. I support it, but with the right team approach.
Okay, last question. We've talked about this in a lot of different ways in this conversation, but as you sit here and you think about the future and everything you've done and grandkids and all these things, what do you want your legacy to be?
Wow, that's a great finish question. There's so many elements to who we are as people that we want our legacy to be. I believe, if nothing else, and this is one thing I remember my father saying all the time, to thine own self be true. Some Shakespearean, I don't even know the play, but he used to always say, to thine own self be true. So conceptually for me, it's a matter of being someone of integrity and love and support and family, all those things that make people look back on you and say that was a good person, right? So whether that's in the practice of law, where you work hard for your clients to get good results and you take care of your clients and be responsive and responsible to those people that pay you to serve them, that's one area. Certainly to your family and the responsibility you have to your family and to your friends and to your loved ones to be there for them. I mean, that's the other side of it. Those two pieces are essential. And lastly, there's things that we all do in our communities. I've been involved in, we didn't even talk about things that I've volunteered with and had leadership with my community. I think that's a message as well, because we all need help. We all need each other to get through whatever we're getting through. So I guess it'd be, my legacy would be that people look back and go, he had integrity and he cared about us as clients, us as family, and us as a community.
Well, I love that, Scott. And with that, we'll wrap up. But for people out there that want to get in touch with you, maybe they want to learn about ethical wills, maybe they want to learn about self-storage, maybe they want to hire you as a mediator. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
The world famous email, scott@wzlegal.com. I'm always checking my emails, that's for sure. I love the fact that you have followers that want to learn about building their law practices. I think you've been a great resource for those folks. And I love the fact that I can help in any way for those folks that have those same questions on any of the topics that we've talked about today. But boy, you did a good job. You really made me open up too. I really haven't talked about a lot of these things in a while. So it's really been a joy, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on.
Well, again, thanks for coming on, Scott.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Founding Partner Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on the latest episodes. You can also connect with Jonathan on LinkedIn and check out the show notes with links to resources mentioned throughout our discussion by visiting www.lawfirmgc.com. We'll see you next time for more origin stories and insights from successful law firm founders.